Good morning, happy Tuesday. Back with the Ranger in Time D-Day battle on the beach. So where we left off yesterday, Ranger was helping Walt on the beach so that he wouldn't get near the bad chemicals in the sand. And so they were getting closer and closer to the balloon where Walt was trying to get. And Ranger kept barking because he knew that there was something bad around, and Walt didn't pay attention and he kept walking. So we're in chapter 11 and it's called Up and Away. Ranger barked again. He'd given the signal. Why wasn't Walt listening? No, stop, there. Ranger jumped up on Walt and pushed him backward with his paws. Walt stumbled, but didn't fall. Ranger sat and kept barking. Walt froze. His eyes darted back and forth from Ranger to the balloon men. Then he stared hard at the patch of sand just ahead and sucked in his breath. Good job, dog. Slowly, Walt and Ranger circled around the funny-smelling spot. Walt stayed back and waited for Ranger to sniff their way through the rest of the sand. The strange smells faded away. Ranger stayed alert, but he moved more quickly, and soon they reached the ridge of smooth stones where they'd taken shelter before. The two men with the balloon still struggled to control it. Whipping winds threatened to rip the cables from their hands. We need to bring it down for now, one of the men shouted. Hold on, Walt called. I'll grab another mooring line. He threw off his pack and pulled out 2 pairs of gloves, one made of rubber and one made of leather. Pulling them on took precious time, but both were crucial. Without the leather gloves, the cables would rip his hands. The rubber gloves underneath saved him from getting shocked by static electricity when he handled the steel lines. Another gust caught the balloon. The men struggled to hold on. One of the soldiers lost his footing in the wet sand and fell forward. He clung to the cable and the balloon dragged him all over the beach. The other mooring line whipped in the wind. Ranger raced to one of the loose cables. He tried to catch it, but the wind twisted it away. The gritty, sandy metal slapped against Ranger's snout, but he leaped into the air again. This time, Ranger caught the end of the cable with his mouth. He turned and raced toward Walt. The steel cable scratched at Ranger's mouth, but he held on until Walt caught the line firmly in his gloved hands. Got it! Walt pulled the cable as tight as he could. So here's what that balloon thing looks like, and then Ranger handing it off to Walt. The other soldier had never let go, even as the cable had jerked him over the sand. He scrambled to his feet and shouted, Let's bring it in! Careful now, Walt called. Together the men pulled in the cables. Finally, the wind seemed to give up on the balloon, and they brought it back down to the top of a truck. They covered it with a net and secured the lines to the sandbags on both sides to keep the balloon weighted down. Ranger sat on the beach and watched the men do a final check of the lines. His mouth was all scratched and sandy from the cable. He was thirsty too, but the only water here was the salty ocean. Ranger felt the wave splash his tail and turned around. The sea had crept up behind him while the men worked. Waves lapped at the pack Walt had dropped on the beach. Ranger barked, but Walt was busy lunging sandbags. Ranger trotted over to the pack, took the strap in his teeth, and tugged it out of the waves. He dragged it all the way to Walt's feet and barked again. You got that mutt trained pretty well, don't you? One of the other men said. He's not mine, Walt answered. He bent and scratched Ranger behind his ear. No clue where he came from, but he's been looking out for me all right. Ranger leaned in to scratch. He liked Walt, but he missed Luke's scratches. Ranger was hungry and thirsty, and his nose still stung from where the cable had slapped at him. When would he get to go home? Come on, dog, let's get some shelter, Walt said. He hoisted his pack over his shoulder and started following the other men back to the protected area behind the ridge of stones. Ranger trotted close beside him. It wasn't as loud as it had been earlier. The rattle of gunfire was more distant. Every so often, a shell explosion would echo over the sand. But the constant booms had mostly been replaced with work sounds, the rumble of trucks and the shouts of officers giving order to men moving supplies. Ranger tipped his head and listened for the hum of his first aid kit. Was his work done yet? All he heard was more men talking. Hey, Big Walt, someone called. Walt looked up and waved at the men unloading 2 nearby jeeps that had stopped side by side in the sand. "Go on, dog." Walt patted Ranger and pointed up ahead. "I'll be right there." He turned and headed for the jeeps. Ranger walked on to the sheltered spot to wait. The shallow ditch was piled with soldiers' things now, packs and canteens and broken radios. Ranger poked around until he found his first aid kit where Walt had tucked it before. It was half buried in smooth stones that must have fallen on top of it in the chaos. Ranger pawed the pebbles aside and nuzzled the old metal box. Still quiet. Then an explosion louder than any of the others split the air. Ranger yelped. Men shouted and scrambled out of the ditch. Ranger followed them onto the sand. The air was full of thick, black smoke, and one of the jeeps was on fire. Where was Walt? He's okay. We'll read one more chapter because I can't leave it end like that. Chapter 12, Into the Flames. Ranger raced toward the flames. He felt the heat of the fire on his face. Smoke burned his nose and stung his eyes. But Walt was somewhere in the middle of the chaos. Ranger had to find him. Men were everywhere. Others lay still on the beach near the burning jeep. The fire popped and crackled. Where was Walt? Ranger raced around the burning jeep. There! Walt lay crumpled in the sand, not far from the jeep's rear tires. Ranger ran up to him and barked. He pawed at Walt's shoulder. The fire was growing hotter by the second. Ranger's skin prickled under his fur. He had to get Walt away from here. Ranger barked again. He nuzzled Walt's ear and licked his face. So here's Walt and Ranger. And then that's the jeep that is on fire. Finally, Walt moved his head. He scrunched up his face, opened his eyes, and blinked into the smoky sky. Then he put a hand on Ranger's back and lifted himself onto his elbows. When he saw the jeep engulfed in flames, his eyes grew wide, and he pushed himself up to stand. Ranger barked again. He jumped on Walt and tried to push him toward the sheltered area with the stones. Walt stumbled backward. His left leg burned as if it was on fire. Walt reached down, and his hand came back covered in blood. The heat burned his eyes. He was choking on smoke, but other men had fallen when the German shell landed. 2 of them still lay sprawled in the sand, far too close to the burning jeep. They needed help. Walt limped over, grabbed one of the men under his arm, and tried to pull him to safety. But the man was twice Walt's size. Walt leaned back with all of his weight just to drag him a few inches. Then Walt's leg collapsed underneath him, and they both fell to the sand. While Walt struggled to sand, Ranger raced to the other man. He pawed at the soldier's belly and licked his face. The men stirred, but did not open his eyes. Walt braced his feet and lifted the man's torso again, but his injured leg was too shaky. He fell back just as a loud pop came off of the flames. Walt looked up. The fire had spread to the second jeep, and for the first time Walt noticed what the men had been about to unload. Boxes of ammunition. Cans of gasoline. If the flames reached them, the whole jeep would explode, and anyone nearby... Walt ignored the pain in his leg. He scrambled to his feet, wrapped his arm around the fallen soldier's chest, and pulled as hard as he could. He managed to drag the man back a foot or so in the sand. The fire crackled and hissed through the front part of the second jeep, inching its way toward the explosive cargo. Walt's face burned with heat from the fire. He braced himself and pulled again. The man slid another few inches. They weren't moving fast enough or far enough. Walt wanted to scream, but his throat burned. The fire and smoke had stolen away from his voice. How long before the whole jeep blew up around them? Walt stared at the stacked-up gasoline cans and ammo boxes as if he could keep the fire away with his eyes. He knew that was impossible. But there was something he could do. It might get him killed, or it might even save them all. It was a chance he had to take. Walt sucked in a deep gulp of smoky air, then he raced toward the burning jeep. The fire crackled with heat that threatened to burn away Walt's uniform, but there was no time to stop and think. He had one chance. Walt pointed to the wounded soldiers. "Stay with them!" he shouted at Ranger. Walt staggered up to the jeep. He squeezed his eyes shut against the heat and smoke and grabbed 2 of the cans in his arms. He lunged them away toward the water and set them down in the sand. Then he started back toward the jeep. Again and again, Walt plunged into the smoke and flames. 2 other men rushed in to help, and together they hauled away the rest of the gasoline and ammunition. Walt set a box of hand grenades carefully onto the wet sand and collapsed beside it, clutching the back of his leg. Ranger raced to Walt's side and nuzzled his shoulder. Walt clenched his teeth and sat up. He put a hand on Ranger's back and stood, leaning hard against him. Together they made their way back to the sheltered area. Whew, thank goodness. Walt sank down and let out a long breath. "You okay, Big Walt?" one of the other soldiers called out. Walt grimaced. "Got hit with the shrapnel. I need to get this bandaged." And then another soldier interrupted him. "What in the devil is a kid doing down here?" "What?" Walt winced in the pain of his leg, and he stood. He stared out over the sand and rocks. Oh no. Leo had left the concrete pillbox. He was walking toward them, plunging the cat under one arm. Just ahead was the deadly stretch of beach Walt had crossed with Ranger. Leo was headed straight for the landmines. Oh no, I hope Leo makes it. But our next chapter that we're going to read tomorrow is called Not Another Step. Have a great Tuesday.